When most people hear the word folklore, they might think of quaint fairy tales told to children around a campfire. But Korean folklore, that's something far more intriguing, far more mysterious, and at times, even a little bit unsettling. So allow yourself to imagine shape-shifting foxes lurking in the shadows, mischievous goblins who delight in causing chaos, and even beings from heaven descending to earth to shape the destiny of the Korean nation. That's what we're talking about today, the captivating folklore of Korea, all the way from the ancient shamans to the modern streets of Seoul. And we'll go through these myths and legends, talking about how centuries of history, religion, and regional traditions all came together to form a rich tapestry, unlike anything that you've heard before. So come with me, as today we continue our series into our folklore guides by country, all available in the playlist, and we talk about the modern nation of Korea. But first, let me welcome you to the channel. If you're coming back, good to meet you, and if it's your first time here, I invite you to click that subscribe button. You'll get plenty of more videos like this. So, we also have no ads in this video or any other videos on the channel, completely uninterrupted for your enjoyment. We are supported by those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the people who check out the merch store, and also the occasional donation through, where is it? Oh yes, the YouTube super thanks, and the PayPal link, which is in the description. You may also find all the other links in the video description, channel description, or the pinned comment. Now, with all that being said, let's continue now, and today we can talk about the folklore of Korea. Enjoy. Of course, like with any other folklore tradition, we have to go way back. We're going to start tracing the origins. Long before any kingdom or written record, the Korean peninsula was home to indigenous, shamanistic, and animistic beliefs. The early Koreans, like many ancient peoples, saw the natural world as teeming, alive with spirits. Rivers, mountains, trees, animals, all inhabited by spirits and gods. And as for the humans, well, it was up to them to try to live in harmony with, or at some points appease, the unseen forces. Of course, this worldview gave rise to a term called Muism, Korea's native shamanism, a kind of polytheistic religion centered on ritual mediation by shamans, mostly women, by the way, called mudang. Now it was their job to sort of communicate between the humans and the spirits. Korean shamans led ceremonies, offering food, dance, and songs to gods and ancestors, a practice that has surprisingly persisted into the present day, despite the later suppressions. But in these early oral traditions, we find creation myths that explain how the land and its features came to be, and a prominent example is the myth of the giant goddess Mago Halme, an earth mother figure said to have shaped the land by carrying mud in her skirt and urinating mighty streams to form rivers. I don't think we'll be swimming in them anytime soon. Well, though Margot does not appear in official records, she survives in folk memory as a kind of archetype of a creator grandmother, a reflection of the significant role of female deities in Korean folk imagination, and we'll certainly get to a few more of them later on. Now, we also hear from these early times the sun and moon myth, that is a tiger and a bear or siblings becoming the sun and the moon together, and also local legends explaining peculiar rocks or hills as the work of giants or spirits. It's myths like this that often show totemistic features. Take this for an example: clans associating themselves with animals like bears, tigers, or snakes as ancestral spirits. And indeed, as we shall see, the bear actually plays a key role in Korea's most famous founding myth. But all truth be told, Korea's earliest folklore was indeed rooted around the shamanism and nature worship, providing a spiritual narrative for a world not yet mapped by historical dynasties. And it is that indigenous foundation that sets a stage for more elaborate stories of the ages to come. Now I suppose we better start with the story of Dangun Wangyong. That kind of marks the dawn of Korean mythology and the birth of the first Korean kingdom. According to legend, first recorded in the 13th century chronicle Samguk Yusa, that is memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms, Dangun was the son of a god and a mortal, and became the founder of Gojoseon, that is often called Old Joseon, Korea's earliest kingdom. Now the myth itself is quite captivating. Hua Nin, the Lord of Heaven, had a son named Hua Nung, who yearned to live among humans. Hua Nin permitted Hua Nung to descend from heaven, gifting him the 3 heavenly seals as tokens of divine authority. Accompanied by spirits of wind, rain, and clouds, Hua Nung and his retinue settled on Mount Taibek, under a sacred Sindan Su, that is a divine altar tree, establishing a heavenly city on earth. The scene of a god-king, bringing order and culture to the human world, is Korea's equivalent of a descent from heaven myth, therefore laying a theocratic foundation for kingship. You'll find plenty more of these in different cultures. Well, even modern-day North Korea has their own descent from heaven myth, which is quite interesting. Well, now we enter the famous bear and tiger episode, often the first Korean myth taught to children. In those days, a bear and a tiger sharing a cave longed to become human. Hwanung accepted their plea, but he gave them a test. They received a bundle of mugwort and garlic, and were instructed to eat only this sacred food, and to avoid sunlight for 100 days. The tiger grew impatient, and failed to endure the cave's darkness. But the bear persevered. And so after 21 days, the bear was miraculously transformed into a woman, whereas the tiger, who couldn't hold out, remained an animal. Now the bear woman, called Ungnyo by the way, was grateful but soon felt quite lonely. You see, she had no companion. Before she had the tiger around, but now she was a human, and well, communication must have been a little bit difficult. So she prayed under the divine tree for a child. Hwanung was moved by her devotion, and decided to take her as a wife, and their union produced a son, that son being called Dangun Wangyong. Thus, Dangun's very parentage symbolizes the union of heaven and earth, a celestial father, and an earthly, formerly ursine mother. Now this motive of a sky god marrying an earth figure, often a bear or other animal turned human, recurs in other Asian myths, and, well, it is a classic founding myth pattern. No one really claims that it's unique to their own culture. I suppose stories like this travel along trade routes and things like that. Everything gets changed to suit a local narrative. Now as for Dangun, he grew up eventually, and he became the first king of Joseon, establishing his capital at Asadal, and by tradition, founding the kingdom in 2333 BCE. The legend states that Dangun reigned for an astonishing 1500 years, during which he moved his capital several times, from Pyongyang to mountaintop Asadal, and back and forth again. Eventually, a new figure from Chinese law, called Qijia, or Jizi in Chinese, was appointed by the Chinese Zhou dynasty to govern the region around 1122 BCE. At that moment, as the myth recounts, Dangun did not simply vanish. Instead, he withdrew back to Mount Asadal and became a mountain god at the ripe age of 1,908 years old. So in other words, Korea's founding father turned into an immortal guardian spirit of the land, worshipped by later generations as a kind of deity of the mountains. This end of the story is rich in symbolism. Dangun's mortal rule ends as political authority shifts, but he transcends into a spiritual realm. That indicates the endurance of native beliefs, even as new regimes rise and fall. Of course, the Dangun myth is the treasured genesis of the Korean nation, so much that it has been called the first sovereignty myth of Korea. It provided ancient rulers and modern nationalists, too, a divine mandate. The Korean people were indeed the children of heaven through Dangun, legitimizing their unity and their independence. Yet critical analysis reveals layers behind the legend. Scholars do note that the story preserves memories of old totemic clans, a bear totem clan, that is Ungyo's people, and a tiger totem tribe, which failed the trial, interacting with an incoming heavenly cult, that is Hwanung's lineage. And so, in fact, the tale could encode a historical alliance, the, quote, divine city of Hwanung's followers, merging with a local bear-worshipping tribe to form a new kingdom. The tiger's failure may symbolize the exclusion or defeat of another clan. The myth also reflects a dual cosmology, the harmonious marriage of a sky father and an earth mother, a theme seen across many Korean foundational myths, and we'll see a few other examples soon. We're not quite done with them. But it is intriguing, too, that Samguk Yusa, a rather Goryeo-era text compiled by a Buddhist monk, is our earliest source for Dangun. The more official Samguk Sagi, 12th century, barely mentions Dangun at all, instead favoring a later Chinese sage as Joseon's founder for a more rational history. Well, this omission and later rediscovery of Dangun show how historical biases can suppress folklore. You see, the Confucian scholars downplayed what they considered to be myth, while later writers revived it to celebrate Korea's indigenous heritage. But despite the questions of veracity, i.e. there's no archaeological evidence of a Bronze Age demigod king living to 1900 years old, the Dangun legend has had very real cultural impact. It remains honored in rituals. For example, in modern Korea, they celebrate the National Foundation Day. That's October 3rd, by the way. It's said to be Dangun's founding date. And even in politics, North Korea once claimed to have discovered Dangun's tomb, a nationalistic claim showing how the myth can be pressed into political service. After all, Pyongyang was one of his capitals, right? So really, the tale of Dangun shows the genesis of the Korean identity. It's half myth, half history, but it's 100% revered. So let's move forward in time a little bit, and we get to the era of the Three Kingdoms. Yes, Korea had a Three Kingdoms era as well. For them it was the 1st century BCE to the 7th century CE. We have Goryeo, Bakje, and Silla, and also the Confederacy of Gaia. Now each of these ancient states had its own founding myth, rich with its own supernatural portents and miraculous births, each of them serving to legitimize the royal lines. These myths were recorded in sources like Samguk Yusa, and even the official Samguk Sagi, which, while generally factual, did summarize some foundation legends. Here's a common thread. It's what we just observed. The motive of a celestial figure and a terrestrial figure, often an animal or earthly one, producing the first king, a reflection of that sky-earth union principle. So let's survey a few of these tales. First we have Goryeo. The northernmost kingdom's foundation is tied to the legend of Jumong, also known as Dongmyeong. Now, according to the Samguk Sagi, Jumong was born from an egg. Now, how does that make sense? Well, his mother, Yuwa, was the daughter of a river god, Ha-Bek, and she was impregnated by sunlight after encountering a heavenly prince, in some versions the sun god or heavenly emissary named Haimosu. Yuwa laid a large egg from which hatched a boy of prodigious ability, and he was named Jumong. Well, once he grew up, Jumong was an adult and proved to be an unmatched archer, and actually his name, by the way, means skilled archer. So he fled a jealous foster father, leading followers to the remote region of Goryeo. In a famous anecdote, when Jumong was pursued to a river, animals formed a bridge to carry him across, nature itself aiding the heaven-born warrior. Jumong established Goryeo and became his first king, revered as the Dongmyeong-songwang. It's a long word in Korean, but we can just say the Holy King of the East. Well, the myth served Goryeo kings by asserting divine paternity, a sun god, and the extraordinary omens at the kingdom's birth, too. And interestingly, Jumong's story doesn't end with him. It branches out into other myths. One Goryeo offshoot is the Buyo legend of Jumong's father, Haimosu, and another egg-born hero, Gumiho, who ruled Buyo, showing how interwoven these narratives really are. And then we have Bakje, a southwestern kingdom. It shares its roots with Goryeo, and it was said to be founded by Onjo, the son of Jumong. Thus, Bakje's legend is less fantastical about Onjo himself. He's simply a prince who migrated south, that is. But Bakje did have a colorful myth regarding Jumong's mother and half-brothers. In folklore, Jumong's son Goryeo and others had episodes that explain names of localities, though these are lesser known. So for brevity, we must say that Bakje's foundation myth is often subsumed under Goryeo's narrative. They kind of get thrown into the same basket. However, equally, Bakje folklore is rich in other areas, like the story of King Munju's daughter who became a spirit, or various temple legends under Buddhist influence. It's worth noting that Bakje, like the others, likely had a totem origin idea too. Their royal family claimed descent from Buyo's heavenly line, linking back to Jumong's sun god father. Next, we have the kingdom of Silla. That is, think of it as southeastern Korea, roughly. But it is perhaps the most elegant founding myth. Its first king, Park Hyok-gyose, was said to have hatched from a bright white egg. Now, the story goes, well, depending on the telling of it, but essentially the chiefs of 6 villages in the Jinhan Confederation, which was pre-Silla, saw a miraculous light and a white horse on a hill. Well, of course, approaching it, they found a large egg from which a baby boy emerged, and it was Hyok-gyose. The infant spoke and radiated charisma. By the age of 13, he was made king of the United Tribes. Now, as for that name, Hyok-gyose, it roughly means bright world, signifying that he would bring light or renewal. Simultaneously, a beautiful girl was discovered born from a dragon or sprung from a well, depending on what account you get. Now, this girl, Ryong, became Hyok-gyose's queen. And again we see the pattern. Hyok-gyose is associated with a heavenly marvel, light from above and an egg, while Ryong is linked to the earth, a well, a sacred water source, a dragon of the land. And in fact, Ryong's name literally means princess of the well, and wells were revered in Silla as sacred sites of life. Now, as for the marriage of Hyok-gyose and Ryong, it thus united the sky and earth symbols to found Silla. But the tale didn't stop at their birth. Later anecdotes tell of Hyokyosei's death, and when he died, his body mysteriously disappeared, leaving only pieces of his rib, which were buried separately, and a giant snake prevented the king and queen's remains from resting together, an eerie ending that is a rare example of a burial myth in founding legends. But this part has invited analysis. Maybe it encodes a ritual or a local deity. The snake itself might symbolize an earth spirit claiming part of him. In any case, Sila's foundation myth, preserved in some Gojoseon, was taken seriously enough, that later kings traced their lineage to Hyokyosei's line, that is the Park clan, even though political power shifted to the Kim clan in the later centuries. Sila produced other myths too. The origin of its 4th century queen Arjong, that is different from the first queen, by the way, just the same name, or the tale of King Kim Arji. A golden box containing a boy descended from heaven was found in a forest by a horse, from which the Kim lineage sprang. In any case, each tale reinforced the notion that Sila's rulers had this divine favor. Well, next we have Gaia, or the Garak Kingdom, which was a smaller confederation, contemporary with the 3 kingdoms, and it had one of the most transnational myths. King Kim Sudo, the founder of Gumwan Gaia, was said to have transcended from heaven as one of the 6 princes born from golden eggs sent by heaven, similar in motive to Sila's egg, by the way. The most intriguing part, however, of Gaia's lore is the story of Queen Hyo Hwang-ok. She is said to have been a princess from a distant land called Ayutta, often identified with Ayodhya in India. According to some Gojoseon, Queen Hyo traveled across the ocean guided by a dream to marry King Sudo, bringing with her a golden pagoda and other treasures. Now, the legend basically suggests early maritime connections, and has even sparked modern cultural exchange. For example, there are monuments in Ayodhya and Gimhae, that is the Gaia region, celebrating this ancient link. But from a folklore perspective, the Hyo Hwang-ok tale stands out as, well, a did it really happen kind of story. While it is recorded in a near-contemporary source, that is Irion's 13th century compilation, historians debate its historicity. You see, some see it as plausible evidence of long-distance contact, and after all, Gaia was a trading hub, while others suspect it to be an embellished legend, perhaps to give prestige to the Kim clan by linking them to a foreign royalty. In any case, it enriches Korean folklore with a rare example of an international marriage myth, adding a dimension that Goryeo is not completely isolated, even in its legendary narrative. Now, it's important to note, too, that these foundation myths were not static. They existed in multiple variations and evolved as soon as they were told. For instance, the names and the details always seem to differ by region. Some version of Sila's founding identify the spawning dragon as a cockatrice, or add that the 6 village chiefs had heard a prophecy of some sort. In Goryeo accounts, Jumong's father is explicitly the son of the supreme sky god, Hua Nin, aligning him subtly with Dangun's lineage, whereas others emphasize the sunbeam impregnation of Yua. But the core narrative, the hero of divine origin, found or born in a miraculous way, it stays put. Peripheral details just shift, resonating with a bit of local pride, or perhaps later evolving moral sensibilities. A critical evaluation also reveals a bit of political bias, too. For example, the Samguk Sagi, written by Kim Bu-sik, gives much attention to Sila's myth, since Sila unified the peninsula, and relatively scant detail on Goguryos, while Samguk Yusa and the monk Iryon includes a broader range, even the Tamna myth of Jeju Island's founding by 3 demigods, and we'll revisit that in the Jeju section later on, by the way. These differences highlight how each writer's regional or dynastic affiliation could color which folklore was elevated or ignored. Once again, not unique just to the Koreans. Well, beyond foundation myths, the 3 kingdoms era teems with heroic legends and supernatural tales. Goryeo has a tale of General Gwangae-do's birth being heralded by a giant dragon, or the legend of Ondal the Fool, a commoner who, through marriage to a princess and brave death in battle, became a kind of unlikely folk hero. Sila's lore is especially abundant, reflecting its rich history and later Buddhist influence. One famous Sila story is the legend of Princess Chomyong's dream that led to finding the relics to cure a plague, involving a guardian dragon, an interplay on Buddhism and shamanic belief. Another is the moving tale of Aryong's song, a different Aryong, by the way, where a virtuous wife's spirit protected the kingdom. An early ghost story with a moral. But we also find the origin of Joyong, a son of the Dragon King of the Eastern Sea. In late Sila, Joyong found his human wife being seduced by a smallpox spirit, but instead of fighting the spirit, he sung and danced, forgiving it in the end, which made the spirit flee in shame. Now this gave rise to the Joyong Mu dance, and the custom of painting Joyong's smiling goblin-like face on doors to ward off evil. The story is quite striking, too. It's a blend of shamanism, warding off diseased demons, with a courtly art form. Joyong's dance became an established ritual. But it also shows how a new narrative can form in a syncretic environment. Joyong is associated with smallpox lore, and that the idea that red bean porridge could appease or repel demons. Indeed, a related legend from later times said that villagers offered patjuk, that is, red bean porridge, to dokkaebi to persuade them to build a protective dam, reflecting a broader belief in red beans' power against evil. Now, as Buddhism spread, the folklore of this era began absorbing the Buddhist motifs, and we start seeing bodhisattvas and arhats in legends, temples built on sites revered in monks' visions, or Buddhist saints tame angry spirits. The Samguk-yusa, being compiled by a Buddhist monk, preserves many such accounts. For example, the story of Won Hyo, a famed monk, has a legendary episode where he survives a night in a tomb by mistakenly drinking brackish water from a skull, a parable about enlightenment. Or the tale of a Sila monk, Myo-gil Sang, carving a miraculous statue guided by a dream. Buddhist miracles like moving pagodas, talking statues, or protective sutras turning away arrows became part of a folklore. These are less mythic founders and more religious legends, but they are enriched the tapestry and coexisted with older shamanic elements. In this period, we even encounter our first textual mention of the mischievous goblins. Samguk-yusa recounts the tale of Lady Dowa and the bachelor Bi-yong, in which a Silla princess, loves a Bi-yong, a spirit or a goblin, and tragedy ensues. The story implies King Jinji of Silla was deposed due to his infatuation with Lady Dowa, and her spectral lover, Bi-yong. The term Bi-yong later became synonymous with goblins, by the way, dokkaebi. This is arguably the earliest recorded story of this kind, and shows a belief in such spirits were present in the royal capital by the 7th century. So it is through these examples that we see during the Three Kingdoms era folklore served as state-building and spiritual function. Founding myths gave divine legitimacy to kings and helped unify peoples under a shared origin story. At the same time, everyday folks could relate to tales of protective deities like Joyong, or moral anecdotes of ghosts and miracles. But there was also regional pride. Each kingdom and each people took pride in their distinct mythical ancestor. A kind of friendly rivalry of myths, I suppose. But we must remember that these stories were transmitted orally for centuries before being written. Thus variations abound. Some variations are simply due to time and the teller, etc. Some accounts name Jumong's mother as Yuwa with a specific lineage, others generically as the daughter of a water god. Some say Gyose's egg was laid by a white chicken from heaven, adding a celestial hen to the mix. In any case, such differences do not diminish the core narrative, but offer fertile ground for scholars to interpret. For instance, the presence of an egg in both Goryeo and Sila myths suggests an ancient motive of rebirth and purity. Eggs as origin of life, you see. And it possibly indicates that the concept of kings hatching from eggs was widely respected. In fact, even the Samguk Sagi notes the similarity, and justifies it as a kind of heavenly miracle. Now the Goryeo dynasty, 918 to 1392. That's another fascinating chapter in Korean folklore, characterized by a syncretation of Buddhist and indigenous elements. Things begin to change. You see, Goryeo was a devoutly Buddhist state. Buddhism was the state religion. It permeated elite culture, but it was also a time when earlier folk beliefs continued to thrive among all classes, and that includes the elite. This blend produced rich folklore, miracles at temples, saintly monks, protective talismans, as well as goblins, foxes, and mountain spirits that coexisted with Buddhas in popular imagination. One of the most significant contributions of Goryeo to folklore was the preservation and compilation of older myths. You see, in the 13th century, the monk Irion compiled the Samguk Yusa, that is the memorabilia of the three kingdoms, we've mentioned it a few times, a collection of legends, folk tales, and of course some historical anecdotes. But unlike the earlier Samguk Sagi, which was a more strict Confucian-style history, the Samguk Yusa unabashedly included foundation myths, miracles, and a lot of marvelous tales in between. A little bit more fun than the straight-laced historical tradition. Now, as for Irion, being a Buddhist monk, he devoted large sections to the lore of the Buddha's land, stories of monks, nuns, and Buddhist relics, but he also recorded the ancient myths of Dangun, Jumong, Gojose, and others that we have already discussed. In many ways, Goryeo saved Korea's mythic heritage by simply taking the time to write it down. Irion's work is considered a treasure of Korean Buddhism and literature. For example, it's thanks to Samguk Yusa that we have the full account of Dangun's legend, the oldest surviving version, and numerous Sila legends. Goryeo's other scholars and writers also pen tales, historical miscellanies that blur into folklore, such as the stories of strange events recorded in the official histories of Goryeo. Now, this indicates an openness in Goryeo's intellectual climate to the supernatural as just another part of history. But Buddhism's influence is evident in many Goryeo-era folk narratives. Buddhist monks became central characters in folklore, often depicted as wise, powerful, sometimes even magically endowed. The notion of hagiography, that is, the lives of saints, merged with local storytelling. In fact, there is a story of Myo-cheong, a monk who claimed the mountain spirit of Mount Paktu told him Goryeo should move its capital, and that the blending of shamanistic mountain worship and Buddhist prophecy, just the syncretism of the era. Although Myo-cheong's rebellion failed, and is historical by the way, the legends that sprouted around it painted him as a kind of mystical figure in contact with the spirits and gods. Another beloved figure is the monk Gojoseon, a 9th century monk/geographer, who according to folklore placed geomantic stones and temples across the land to channel spiritual energy. Many tales credit Dozon with shaping Goryeo's fortune through feng shui-like divination, demonstrating how even technical tasks were now mythologized. Now, Goryeo's royal family itself spawned legends too. King Taijo Wangyong, the founder, was said to have been prophesied by a guardian mountain spirit and aided by a dragon of the West Sea. One tale actually recounts that as a young general, Wang Yong was guided by a vision of a dragon that revealed a secret shallow water route, enabling him to surprise his enemies at sea. Another divine intervention story, elevating his status to something above that of a mere mortal. But given Goryeo's Buddhist leanings, temple legends also flourished. One famous example is the story behind the massive Buddhist bell of Gyeongju. Now, according to the legend, when casting a giant iron bell for a temple, the bell would not ring properly until a monk received a revelation. A pure sacrifice was needed. Now, tragically, a young child was sacrificed, thrown into the molten bronze, and thereafter the bell rang with a haunting tone that seemed to echo the child's cry, mi la, that is mother in the old Silla language. Now that's a bit gruesome, don't you think? The story does show how folklore sometimes explained the unearthly sound quality of an artifact through a spiritual or moral tale. That poor kid. Not good. The key elements that need for a sacrifice to appease the spirits of metal echo shamanistic practice, yet are folded into a Buddhist context, that is the temple bell. Goryeo's Buddhist chronicles didn't officially endorse such sacrifices, of course, but the tale survived in oral tradition, showing that older shamanic idea of placating the object spirits. Now, what about ghost stories and supernatural encounters? Of course, they're also found in Goryeo folklore. Buddhism teaches about hungry ghosts and transmigration, concepts which enriched the local ghost lore. A well-known story from late Goryeo or early Joseon sources is that of Arang, the virtuous daughter of a magistrate in Miryang. Arang was murdered, unfortunately, and her ghost began appearing, causing trouble until a new magistrate promised to investigate her death properly. Once her killer was found, Arang's ghost was finally appeased. And this tale, though often dated to early Joseon, likely has roots in Goryeo's mix of Confucian justice and Buddhist afterlife. Goryeo atmosphere of relative religious pluralism allowed such stories to propagate widely. Now let's discuss the dokkaebi and gumiho in the Goryeo context. Now just to remind you, the dokkaebi means goblin, though first mentioned in Sila's story, likely became a staple of oral folk tales during Goryeo. These goblins were conceived as mischievous, capricious spirits, often inhabiting old things, that is, a rusted tool or a centuries-old tree could perhaps spawn a dokkaebi. Now, we don't have written Goryeo folktale books, those come a little bit later. But scholars note that the notion of dokkaebi as trickster spirits was already well known by this time. In fact, one of the earliest documented words for goblin, bi-yong, as we saw, appears in the Samguk-gyusa, referring to a spirit lover. Another term, dokkaebi, appears in folklore references by the Goryeo period. One interesting hint, a 9th century Chinese miscellany, that is Yoyang Zazo, mentions a Korean tale about two brothers. This is the story of Hyungbu and Norbu, actually a Joseon tale of two brothers and a magic gourd, and is also something about a goblin club, that is a dokkaebi bangmangi. Now this suggests that some Korean folk tales, goblins included, had traveled to China, or at least known early on. The prototypical dokkaebi in folk tales is a jester of sorts, sometimes punishing greedy people with pranks, but other times rewarding kind people with magical gifts. For example, people might have told the forerunner of the famous story, The Old Men with Wen, where a nice old man dances with goblins, and they remove the wen, that is the tumor, on his face as a reward. But the greedy man tries the same, and the goblins, offended by his bad dancing, stick the removed wen back onto him. Well, a classic karmic humor tale. While our first written compilation of such tales came in Joseon, it is likely that they were part of Goryeo's oral tradition. And how far that goes back, well, it's anybody's guess. Notably, the dokkaebi's image in Goryeo times would have been amorphous, described in stories, but not yet standardized visually. Not like the Japanese oni. I'm sure much later they would be drawn kind of like this, with horns and clubs, but of course that was a much later development. Now we get on to the gumiho, that is a nine-tailed fox. The concept of foxes turning into beautiful women or other disguises was imported from Chinese lore, but it certainly took on Korean flavors. An early reference to a nine-tailed fox in Korea comes from Chinese records. The ancient Chinese text, Shanhai Jing, that is the classic of mountains and seas, mentions a nine-tailed fox in a distant eastern land called Qingqiu, which later commentators interpreted as referring to the Korean peninsula. Well, by the Goryeo period, we have mentions of fox spirits in historiography. Goryeo historians recorded sightings of strange foxes believed to portend unrest. Now, these foxes, far from benevolent, were rather seen as harbingers of misfortune, or even embodiments of deception. One Goryeo tale speaks of a fox that could mimic a human's voice to lure people, an eerie forerunner of many later stories. Yet interestingly, not all fox spirit tales were negative in the early times. Chinese and perhaps early Korean lore sometimes portrayed them as wise, long-lived creatures, and if you were lucky, they might even take pity on you and help you out with something. A remnant of this appears in Korean tradition with stories of kind gumiho being tricked by cruel humans. But still, the dominant Korean version solidified later. By late Goryeo or early Joseon, gumiho were almost uniformly evil or dangerous, seducing men to eat their livers or hearts. Well, there's a case in point. The story attributed to the early Joseon writer Kim Si-seop, who lived just after Goryeo. In his tale, Gumyo Sinwa, a fox woman falls in love with a scholar, but cannot escape her nature in one version, while in another she is tragically sacrificing herself, showing, of course, conflicting portrayals. But the mere fact that such tales were written by early Joseon literati implies that they were circulating in the late Goryeo oral culture. Folklore in Goryeo was also deeply connected to shamanic rites, often under the patronage of Buddhism. The royal court itself engaged in rituals that, while cloaked in Buddhist language, were essentially shamanistic, like praying to mountain spirits for rain, or inviting temple monks to perform exorcistic dances. Goryeo kings consulted geomancers and monk maguses for state decisions, indicating that the supernatural was indeed part of governance. And these practices birthed their own legends. For instance, a court monk's successful rain-making could become legendary, even if it was just a bit of a coincidence. Goryeo is also when we see formal recognition of certain folk traditions. The court designated official shamans for certain tasks, and is syncretized with Buddhism by, for example, identifying some native gods with bodhisattvas. The sea goddess was often identified with the bodhisattva of compassion, just for an example. Well, this created a layered folklore. A sea captain may pray to both the dragon king of the sea from shamanism, and Guan Num, or Guan Yin, from Buddhism, and this wouldn't be any contradiction in doing it. Stories would reflect both. A sailor's tale of surviving a shipwreck, you might attribute it to the Dragon King's turtle carrying him ashore, and a vision of Guan Yin guiding him. A blend of two traditions. But finally, it's crucial to note how regional folklore within Goryeo was recorded. Goryeo controlled most of the Korean peninsula, and even parts of Manchuria. It inherited local legends from former Bakje and Goryeo lands. Many Samguk-Yusai entries are basically Goryeo-era retellings of local myths. For example, the miraculous youth of Non-san story, or the origin of Jiri-san, that is Mount Jiri. These entries often start something like, in the town of so-and-so, there was a legend that so-and-so, things like that. And that shows how local origins persisted and were finally written down by the likes of Iryon. Here's another example. Samguk-Yusai tells of a smallpox goddess, Lady Manura, whose origin story explains why offerings are made to her to protect children. Smallpox deities were widespread in East Asia. Goryeo folklore localized it, tying it to maybe a historical figure's deified form. And that was recorded too, giving scholars insight into how folk religion addressed these kind of epidemics, or puts it into something they can understand. Another example from Iryon is the story of General Seo He tricking the Khitan by invoking a mythical shared ancestor, Dangun, which is more of a historical anecdote than folklore. But in how it's told, it certainly shows reverence for myth in diplomacy. That's for sure. Well, with the advent of the Joseon Dynasty in 1392, Korea underwent a bit of a ideological shift. The rulers embraced a kind of neo-Confucianism as a state orthodoxy, and that favored rationalism, hierarchy, and above all, secular governance. As for Buddhism, that was suppressed. Monasteries were closed, moved to remote areas in the most generous of cases, and anything deemed superstitious, that includes shamanism and folk rites, were frowned upon by the elite. On the surface, it might sound like a death knell for folklore, and indeed, the Confucian scholar officials saw many folk beliefs as unseemly or even harmful. Well, this was not going to be conducive to the new moral order, so they decided to take steps to stamp them all out. Yet paradoxically, the Joseon era is also incredibly rich in recording the evolution of folklore. Now, how does that make sense? Let me explain. Essentially, while officialdom tried to eliminate or control folk practices, the common people, and even some literati, some gentry in private, continued to practice them. Many educated individuals began compiling folk tales as literature or curiosities. The result is a dynamic tension, suppression on one hand, and an outpouring of folk creativity, often underground or informal, on the other. So first of all, we have shamanism, the indigenous faith. It bore the brunt of the Joseon suppression. Early Joseon law taxed shamans heavily and banned them from performing certain rituals, branding them as obscene superstition. The government periodically rounded up the shamans, the Mu-dang, and even expelled them from the capital. A bureau was even set up to catalogue and monitor them. Can't get away with anything anymore, can't you? Well, Neo-Confucian writings disparage Mu-dang as deceitful women, leading the populace astray. But despite this, shamanism proved to be resilient. It survived by going underground, or adapting. Royal and aristocratic families would publicly eschew shaman rites, but privately they still consulted fortune tellers or sponsored exorcisms during epidemics, with a knowing wink that it was just tradition. Well, among the common folk, life events, weddings, births, funerals, they often still involved shamanic ceremonies. They always did. Maybe they always will. Folklore in this period reflects an interesting duality. Outwardly, written stories might satirize shamans, but the continued existence of those stories indicates shamans' presence. For example, a common character in Joseon anecdotes is the Myo-seong, a female shaman often portrayed comically or as a foil to a clever Confucian scholar, yet always in a way that acknowledges that she's still part of the society. Well, one of the richest sources of Joseon folklore comes from the Ya-dam, or unofficial story collections written by the learned literati gentlemen. These Ya-dam were short tales or anecdotes, sometimes factual, sometimes pure fiction, most of the time somewhere in the middle. They often included ghosts, foxes, goblins, miraculous events, and the more of these they included, well, the more they sort of leant more towards the fiction. But they stand in as a reference to real-life people and events, I suppose. Now, curiously, even as the Confucian ideology reigned, these educated authors enjoyed and recorded tales of the supernatural, perhaps viewing them as harmless entertainment or moral fables rather than religious truth. We take, for example, Yu Mong-in, a 17th century scholar who compiled the O Ya-dam, filled with ghost stories and strange occurrences that he had heard from people. And one story tells of a gumiho who had lived as a faithful wife to a man. Remember, that is a fox spirit, right? Only to be discovered when hunting dogs sensed her. A tale that elicits both fear and pity for the fox woman, suggesting a more sympathetic twist in an otherwise frightening trope. Another tale might involve a dokkaebi's hat, which grants invisibility, being stolen by a cheeky protagonist. Stories like this serve multiple purposes: entertainment in social gatherings, moral lessons, or just simply as a record of strange happenings. Now, under the Neo-Confucian influence, filial piety, loyalty, and chastity became key virtues. We see folklore being reinterpreted to emphasize those values. The classic example is the ghost tale of Chun Yang, where a faithful wife's spirit helps to bring her unfaithful husband to justice, aligning the supernatural with the Confucian virtue. Or take the dokkaebi tales, earlier folk tales were just often humorous or scary, but in Joseon compilations, they sometimes take on a moral quality. One noted by folklorists is that a Joseon version of a goblin tale might add the good protagonist was rewarded because he was filial to his parents, a detail not originally part of the oral tale, but inserted into it to make it more morally palatable for the times. Another example of ideological editing. However, many tales remain subversive or just plain fun, flying under the radar of censorship. Dokkaebi goblin tales in Joseon folklore fully blossomed as comical, harmless monsters. It's in this era that their iconic attributes appear in stories. The dokkaebi's club that can summon wealth, the dokkaebi's hat that makes one invisible, and their love for contests, riddles, or wrestling with humans. Now, one beloved folktale is The Man Who Befriended a Goblin, in which a poor but clever man drinks and jokes with the dokkaebi, receiving gold only to outwit them in the end and send them away when they become annoying. They often portray dokkaebi as goofy and gullible, rather than truly fearsome, reflecting perhaps an increased psychological distance. People were less likely to actually fear goblins in the late Joseon age, but they enjoyed them as folklore characters, and indeed by this time the image of the dokkaebi might even have been influenced by Japanese depictions. Late Joseon and early modern illustrations drew dokkaebi with horns and tiger skin loincloths, virtually identical to the Japanese oni. Well, mainly due to this cultural exchange and a little bit of later colonial influence perhaps. Now, as for ghost stories, they reach a peak in popularity during the Joseon period. Well, they're usually spirits of those who died unjustly, or perhaps with lingering grievance. Joseon's strict social norms and often tumultuous events, wars, factional purges, etc., unfortunately provided many real tragedies which then birthed their own ghost legends. The aforementioned Arang story actually happened under early Joseon administration and became so famous that Miryang, the town, still holds an Arang festival. Another, the story of Janghwa and Hongryong, tells of two stepsisters betrayed and murdered by their cruel stepmother. The ghosts haunt the village until a new magistrate investigates and punishes the evildoers. This tale, recorded in the 17th and 18th century, encapsulates Confucian morality with a chilling supernatural veneer. An evil step-parent, virtuous magistrate, filial daughters even in death. But it also shows how regional folklore carried on. Janghwa and Hongryong's story is set in Gaepong County, and likely was a local oral tale that made it into print because it resonated with broader values. Notably, these ghost tales serve as a social safety valve of sorts. In a rigid society where speaking out was difficult, stories about vengeful ghosts punishing corrupt officials or wicked family members provided a kind of narrative justice of sorts. Well, they weren't openly political, but they certainly carried an implicit critique. A bad magistrate might escape human law, but ghostly retribution could get them in the end. And then we have Confucian biases. Those are meant that some older myths were downplayed or rationalized. The Dangun myth, for instance, wasn't officially celebrated in Joseon as history. Yet, Dangun was not forgotten among the people. There remained shamanic rites to Dangun in some regions, and a cult at a supposed shrine on Mount Taebaek. Late Joseon Silak, that is, practical learning scholars, began to reappraise Dangun as well, as they searched for Korea's authentic past. By the 18th to 19th centuries, a nascent sense of Korean nationalism within some intellectual circles led to a renewed interest in indigenous lore, and that includes the story of Dangun. We can certainly see it as a tug-of-war between official ideology and cultural identity. There's no other way to really frame it. But for most of Joseon, official records avoided fantastical stories. But near contemporary sources like the 15th century Annals of King Sejong did quietly record, for example, the sighting of a Gui-sin, a ghost or strange phenomena, often adding the note, "People say something something, but who really believes it?" Kind of an interesting half-acceptance. Not saying that they don't believe it. I suppose they're just dipping their toes in, testing the water. Now, regionally, we have Jeju Island. And during Joseon, that retained much of its own unique folklore. While on the mainland, certain provinces were known for particular tales. Let's look at the Hamgyong region, that is in the northeast. They've got stories of tigers as mountain lords, reclusive goblins too. And then in the Honam region in the southwest, they were famous for their pansori stories like Hongbu and Norbu, their tale of two brothers, one kind, one greedy, involving a magic gourd from a bird, essentially a folk tale with a moral story attached to it. Old Joseon folk tales often incorporate social satire. For example, the character of Mr. Byon, that is Byon Gang-sue, a cowardly person, but a pretentious one too, who ends up getting scammed by a goblin, implicitly mocking Yang Ban, who claim knowledge but have no substance. And then there are mask dance dramas, popular folk entertainment, especially in late Joseon, directly lampooning the elite and the clergy, and within them folklore elements like greedy monks and foolish aristocrats, along with meddling shamans, appear as the stock set of characters. Now, even as Confucianism tried to erode shamanism, ironically the royal court itself ended up patronizing a certain folk rite out of necessity. You see, during the Joseon era, if there was a drought or an epidemic, the king would often sanction rituals that were essentially shamanistic in nature, but performed by court approval or personnel. For example, rain rituals. They might involve a procession to a mountain altar, which is basically appealing to a mountain spirit. A shamanic act, of course, albeit it is done by Confucian officials to avoid empowering the Mudang shamans. Now, when smallpox, considered to be the dreaded disease of the age, think about Europeans suffering with the Black Plague, Black Death, rather, all that sort of thing. Well, when smallpox struck the royal family, they also secretly invoked the smallpox deity, Mamyong Halmonye, with offerings, despite officially condemning such a practice. A dichotomy noted by contemporary observers, of course. And indeed, one late Joseon document complains that, quote, even after all these bans, when a calamity occurs, they revert to the shamanic rites, showing an enduring belief in folklore among Koreans, even those in power. But then we have the gumiho law, and in Joseon times it became truly codified as terrifying. The nine-tailed fox was a staple of cautionary tales. A beautiful woman, which was actually a fox in disguise preying on an unweary man. A kind of succubus, I suppose, possibly reflecting male anxieties in the patriarchal society about female sexuality or deceit. Well, a well-known Joseon tale is the Fox Sister, where a family's third daughter is actually a fox in human form, who devours her brothers one by one until she is discovered. Pretty grisly story, told to children as a warning. Yet there are also romanticized fox tales, Gu family book-style narratives of a gumiho yearning to become a human through love. One such account, in late Joseon, says a fox can become a human if they refrain from killing or eating for 100 days. Some versions say 1,000 days. And also they have to win a genuine love from a human. The variations show a tension between viewing the gumiho as pure evil versus allowing the possibility of redemption, perhaps influenced by Buddhist compassion or simply just imaginative storytelling. Well, by the late 19th century, as Joseon opened up to the world, we start getting accounts from foreigners noting the superstitions of Korea. They observe shamans performing rituals, folk remedies, and so on, giving us an outsider snapshot. It's evident that despite under 500 years of conservative regime, the folkloric imagination was certainly unquenched. If anything, the contrast made folk tales a cherished outlet. What you couldn't say openly, you could say via a ghost story or a mask play. It reveals the undercurrents of the society, the fears, the hopes, and its irreverent humor. But it also shows how external influences, Confucian morality, Buddhist persistence, and even a bit of Japanese art were absorbed into that rich Korean folk tradition. We could go on forever, couldn't we? Maybe I will. Maybe I will. I don't know. In any case, I think that's enough for today. So I'm going to read the top-tier patrons and supporters out. Thank you so much for keeping everything ad-free, supporting the channel. Kimberly, Christine, Sally Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfanir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neurona, Darren, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Guga Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftas, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nevatari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum? Rhonda, Carrie, Catty P, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, and Altazakin. Okay. Thank you very much. That's it for me for today, unless you want to go watch another video, which you're welcome to do. But I need to rest. So, thank you very much for listening. As always, lots of love to you all. Look after each other, and I will see you whenever you feel inclined on returning. Because as always, you know exactly where I will be. Right here on YouTube, whenever you're ready to come back. Good night and farewell for now.